And we're live with our 119th episode of Absolute AppSec. I'm Ken Johnson at CK Tricky on Twitter, joined by my co-host, Seth Law at Seth Law on Twitter. Seth, say hi.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to another episode. There's a lot going on in the world right now. We are happy to be back and talk. I don't know if we really have a lot of announcements this week, Ken. I know we're still getting rolling back into 2021. We're kind of waiting to see what conferences look like before we start scheduling some of our trainings. That being said, if you're interested, please reach out. Right? We can always set something up virtually. Not that we love the virtual trainings, but it is an option. I don't know, Ken, what you got this week? Oh, wait, I did want to share my hold on. What do you have this week while I pull it up?
Yeah, if you look behind me on the floor, there's some shirts with packages, and I've got some bubble wrap back there. So I'm mailing out the swag. So if you've been on the show, just be on the lookout for an email from me. I've been doing it in waves, like emailing people to make sure their addresses are up to date. And so that so the first mailing wave goes out tomorrow. And then, but I just keep continuing to hit people up via email. Those that I haven't gotten a response from, I've just been going to Twitter to try and get a response. So, yeah, long story short, just keep an eye out if you've been on the show and you're expecting a t-shirt or swag for an email from us. So,
okay. Yep. Yeah. I wanted to share, this cracked me up this week, right? This is from Clint Gibbler, who's been on the podcast. It was part of his TLDRSec email this week. Basically a flow chart on when to use C. Right.
Practically never.
Practically never. I loved that "Are you an expert?" list, right? An expert fulfills two of the following. You can quote RFCs from memory. Okay. You are on the C lane committee, 20 years of professional experience, 10 plus inch gray beard, or personal friends with Dennis Ritchie, right? Like that's the only thing that qualifies you as an expert in C. So basically it's Stefan. The rest of us just need to leave C alone. That was my take, right?
Yeah. I think somebody, because we discussed it in Slack, had said that they they had a reason. I don't remember what it was. There was a reason they said that they were talking about. There was a reason for C with the traditional reasons you would use C, but I can't remember. I don't even know why I brought that up. I can't remember the conversation.
No, I've used C in the past when but again, I'm kind of a graybeard when it comes to that. Like I actually took courses in C. Like that was one of the first languages I learned. But the memory issues and handling of memory it's painful, right? It's so much easier to spin something up in Python or Rust, Go, whatever else, right? Depending on what you actually need. But performance is usually what they step back to, right? Yeah.
Hey, also, I think we should also mention while we're talking about sort of like little tidbits of stuff going on about the Bugtraq being shut down. Probably if people hadn't heard that might be interesting to some folks.
Oh yeah, Bugtraq.
When did that start? When was that first? Was it like 1993, 95?
Yeah, maybe? It would have been somewhere around that time. Oh, yep, 93. I'm looking at here. I'll show the description. It's all archived. It's from Security Focus. Was the organization that was running it, right? But here's a good description on it. This was like the original CVE announcement, bug announcement, mailing list. 1993. There were times in my career where this was this was the main source of what's going on in the community. This was before Twitter, like people, and it was pretty open, right? Like it became moderated. Sounds like if you look at the history in 1995, but the first couple of years, it was just an open mailing list. Anybody could submit things, right? But 1993, Aleph 1 took it over in 96, right? Aleph 1, if you don't know who that is, go do some research. He's the one that made exploits popular, right? Like, hacking for fun and profit. That's, it comes from Aleph 1. But yeah, it was, I don't know, like it feels like a loss to me, but then I think about it and I haven't been following it for a few years. I mean, did you ever subscribe? Were you ever, watching it?
Yeah, at one point, but those days are gone. Not because of any other reason than the things that I need to subscribe to typically are Google Groups and Slack. So it's just kind of went in the way of those are the easiest way. And newsletters. It's kind of just the easiest way to get news, and then
it was definitely just a raw feed, right, of what was going on in the industry. And at the time, everything was mixed in. So there wasn't any specialization in application security or network security. So you would see firewall updates. You would see like exploits being posted. But I honestly remember early in my career, like going to my first security gig, like interview, and them asking, "Hey, how do you stay up to date with the security industry?" And Bugtraq was the first thing I said, right? Because it was the only thing that was out there that actually summarized. But it did require it required a lot of time, right? I remember spending, at least an hour every couple of days going through everything that was in there to see what was relevant to me. I remember XSS popping up in there, and so it does feel rather poignant that it's gone away, but I understand why, right? It became less relevant over time. People have gravitated to other mediums to consume that information. So, yeah.
Interesting. Well,
rest in peace, Bugtraq. Rest in peace. Yeah.
I was into hacking before I got into the military. But when I was in the military and overseas, our bandwidth sucked. It was terrible. I mean, like an entire on the ship, we shared a T1 line. And I think that was like 1.544 megabits or something like that for a T1 line. And that was spread throughout the entire ship. And that's like in port, like out to sea, it's, you get what you get. So what I would do is I would go to the ways I would find out about new tooling and new stuff is I would go to these, I think I've told you this before. I'd go to these stands in Italy and where I was stationed, and they would have hacking magazines in Italian. So I would have to try and translate because I learned a little bit of Italian when I lived in Italy, obviously, because we didn't have a base or anything. You just live out in town, and obviously they don't speak English. Wouldn't make any sense. Most people don't want to speak English or don't speak English. I don't know which, but so you have to try and decipher what it's saying. And then you get these CDs full of tools and of new tools released. And that's basically how I got my information. So yeah, you want to talk about the weird ways that we used to get this stuff. It's just so much better nowadays than back then. It was such a niche, underground kind of thing. Still felt like. So.
Yeah, I mean, realistically, you talk about the hacker zine, industry. I don't know what you want to call it. Culture back then, right? In the late 90s, early 2000s. I mean, you had your 2600 groups. The DEF CON groups were just kind of starting up at that point. But if I go back to the 90s, right? Frack.
Yeah.
Frack was amazing, right? It just, that's Aleph 1, right? Is in Frack, his paper, that's where he released it. And there's a whole bunch of really, really interesting topics. And it's still pretty relevant. Like I went back recently. If you haven't ever looked at Frack, if you want to know kind of what that fill is like, I think it's just frack.org, right? I'm trying to remember. Yep.
Yeah, I thought it was frack.org.
Yeah, I'll post that up really quick. Yeah, and it's all very kind of like we were saying last week, right? Like counterculture,
Freaks and geeks, man. That's basically what it was.
Yeah. Yeah, frack.org. But getting that information was a lot harder, right? There wasn't people that were posting, or if they did, they summarize it. And Frack and the 2600 zines, those were actually printed magazines that you could go and buy, right? Like in Italian, that's probably what you were buying over there, or something similar. That had instructions on how to do different things. A lot of like AT&T articles on AT&T, or phone networks, or war dialing. I mean, it was a fun time for sure, but it was, it took a lot to actually explore. And you were also fighting that kind of gray line of, hey, is this actually legal? Am I allowed to do this?
No. Although the laws have certainly developed quite a bit more than back then. I mean, honestly, there were no, it's actually a lot like what we've been discussing and everyone's been discussing lately with technology and sort of legal precedents, the technology outpacing the laws essentially, and the laws trying to catch up. And there wasn't much. There was, I think Mitnick was one of the high profile ones back then. And, there was another person, Sammy, a little bit later, with MySpace. Yes, kids. Sammy was once a resident of the state, shall we say?
Yes.
Before all the cool white hat stuff, research, there was some, but that's what I always talk about. It's always like we always talk about it. It's like, man, like it could have happened to anybody, because just like the nature of what we did was really walking a fine line. And that's why, last week made that comment about some of us did it better than others, but and it's just kind of interesting to look back.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, some of the stuff that we did back in the day was definitely walking that line. And that was all part of it, right? I remember the phone companies were always a huge target because they controlled the communication, right? Like they controlled being able to get access to information, and and there was no one else besides Ma Bell or AT&T or whatever subsidiary you happen to live under. There was no other way to get through that. And we can start talking about PBS, or not PBS, sorry, PBX hacking, and trying to find ways to connect to different BBSs where you could actually get access to information. And that was one of the reasons why when AOL and those other things first launched, it was so revolutionary, was because it gave us access to that information by being able to connect locally, right? There was a whole distribution network to be able to pass text files and cracked games and things like that around in the BBS days. I know I'm I'm waxing nostalgic here, so I'll stop. But it was very much a gray area that we were living in. And, it was kind of a poor kid growing up. You wanted to play a game. You couldn't afford to, the whatever, $20-$30 to go buy it. There was a way to get it, but it cost you hours and hours of trying to download something over a 2400 baud connection to a BBS, right?
Man, I remember being in 6th grade in public school, and I was definitely a poor kid growing up, and basically that was the first time I'd come into contact with a computer. It was an Apple, and I could not get myself away from it. I mean, in class, it was the first thing and only thing I ever wanted to gravitate towards. And I think that never really ended, you know, and I think that's why I knew like this was the right thing when I became an adult to do. Cause it was so amazing. It was like, what is this thing? What can you do with it? And it was so much fun to just like check out all the edges of the OS and what it could do. And it was just fascinating to me. And I think public school is actually how until about, I want to say maybe ninth grade is when we, you know, were able to afford a gateway PC. Remember the cow on the box pattern? Yeah. PC gateway PCs. Yeah. So we had one of those, and that's where I cut my teeth on downloading things that, you know, now would be considered pirated or whatever. Again, it was pretty easy to just share stuff back then.
Yeah.
So, and I laugh now too when my son what's that?
Yeah. No. Yeah. When your son comes in.
No, it just makes me laugh when he's like, oh, you know, well, before I fixed our network, when you would have like slow moments on the network, I'm like, dude, do you even know what I used to have to go through? Like 10 minutes to just try and get on the internet, and God help you if somebody picked up a phone, you're done.
Yep.
That whole process starts over. That's just getting on the internet. Trying to stay on the internet, it's a whole other ballgame. And trying to do anything on the internet that's meaningful back then was such, I don't know how we did not plan on having this conversation, but it is kind of fun to relive the early days.
Yeah. I mean, I remember waking up at, you know, like 5 a.m, 4:35, so I could connect to my favorite BBS and take my like turns on, you know, they were role-based multiplayer games, right? Like Trade Wars 2000. It was, because there was no other time, right? You know, if I tried to do it after school, somebody would inevitably pick up the phone and screw stuff up. And I found a way to connect to people, you know, who are of similar mindset. It was that's what the internet was for me at that time, you know, just a way to sort of escape the people that I really didn't, which was most people didn't really get, you know, wasn't interested in. Yeah. And that was a really easy way to connect to anybody that was interesting, you know? So it was pretty cool. Well, and it all went back to and I know we've talked about this before, right? From an inclusion perspective, and like, you know, not knowing where something amazing is going to come from or inspiration will come from. But like, you were taken on the level of just being another person on the BBS or on the internet without like looking at the fact that maybe you were a 14-year-old kid, or maybe you were coming from a different situation. Like, I mean, honestly, like I remember connecting in through the university in my local town, and we connected into the DARPANET, right? Like into the ARPANET, and we were just scanning for systems and then connecting to them. And we would log in using default creds, right? Like LP, line printer, like, you know, admin accounts, like whatever, you know, happened to be there, like default Unix creds that we got a list of from a zine. And then we would chat with the operators about like, oh, where are you at? Right. Like they didn't care that we were logged in. They would see we were logged in, but they would chat with us about it. They wouldn't actually like kick us off, but it was definitely that gray area. But it was all this exchange of information, this kind of free exchange of, oh, what are you working on? Like, what's, you know, hey, this is a system we haven't seen before, that kind of thing that like we don't necessarily get as much of nowadays, right? You know, everything's pretty siloed out. Yeah. And rightfully so, right? There's a lot of things that we ended up getting access to that we probably shouldn't have. But anyway, maybe we should, you know, move on to something else. And
we can. We've got plenty of stuff that we can chat about. It's your choice on what we've got several topics. So pick one you want to go with first, Seth.
Like I haven't looked into that the cache poisoning one that's on
Oh,
the Snoop blog, but I would like to know what's going on there. And then we could talk SSRF after that.
okay, cool. So the background on this is, and I'm posting the link, and just a real quick overview of cache poisoning in general before we get into this. So James Kettle and Port Swigger research team. Excuse me. This drink is carbonated, giving me the burps. Anyways, so did this research. We talked about it. I think we talked about it a year ago too. I mean, just the first initial sort of what web cache poisoning is. This article is SNCC building upon that research to find it in modern frameworks. So I'll go into that in a second, but the general gist with web cache poisoning is, God, I've explained this before and it's going to be a nightmare to explain it again, I think. So let me try and do my best. So there's, with web caches, you have to think about it as there is a user, there is a proxy that sits in front of the web server that the user is going to communicate with. And then there's the actual web server and the web app running on that web server. And this article focuses on the web apps that are running on that web server, the frameworks, specifically the web frameworks that the frame apps are, or that the web apps are built in. So the sort of the modern way to speed things up has been, hey, look, if this request isn't any different from any other request, then why are we trying to, with the web app, process all that information and then use up valuable computation time, introduce some latency? Why not, if Seth's request the same as my request, just echo that back at the proxy layer without even hitting the web? I mean, no reason to talk to get a response from the web server. Just send back whatever the last response was for the same type of request. That's the general gist. So this would work well if we're talking about, you know, some sort of especially like static pages that are mostly static content, but like maybe just a few variables change on the page. I guess a good example of that would be like a weather app or something, or like a weather page. Like your weather in Utah is going to be a little bit different from mine here in Virginia, obviously.
Yep.
So, but the rest of the layout and all that stuff, it's going to be the same. Okay, so that's caching, web caching in a nutshell. If your request looks like my request, I can send back data. So what they found with web cache poisoning was there's a concept of keyed and unkeyed inputs. And the important factor of that is a keyed input will be is it like a known, it's like known and will be reflected back in that request, in the response to the request. So I'm going back over here. I think the sort of interesting part here, and you can, if you have the link, you can read up. We've got it up on the screen. So in their example, what they did was they showed a request with a get request with some parameters. Basically, it was like Q equals cat, right? And in the response, they're supposed to be like, hey, your query returned a cat, right? What they found was, if, like in this example, they used Q equals cat, ampersand UTM, so a new key value pair, UTM equals something, and then semicolon, Q equals dog, right? So you actually are sending you're sending the same parameter twice, and the second parameter at the web application layer is overwriting the first. That semicolon is being at the web application layer because of the web framework. It's being interpreted as a parameter. It's overwriting the Q equals cat. And instead of saying, forget that, it's going to be Q equals dog. Here's your response for your query of a dog, right? So that gets cached now. So,
so basically what you're saying then, that the record with the search query of dog is being cached as Q equals cat by the caching engine, right?
Correct. The caching engine, you'll see. So yes, that's a good way to put it. So if you sent the same request without the semicolon Q equals dog, and you just sent Q equals cat, the proxy sees that as, well, you're making the same request as Ken, who did Q equals cat. Let me send you the response for that. So it'll say your query is dog, right? Because I sent in the semicolon, the reverse proxy didn't see it as a parameter. It never recognized that as a parameter. It forwarded it onto the web application. The web application returned a different response than what, because it wasn't a query for a cat. That got cached. And now your request for Q equals cat, it thinks, oh, well, whenever someone says Q equals cat, parameter with a cat value, then we send back the response of the, your query was for a dog, just because of some confusion between like it not understanding that semicolon is now at the web app layer being interpreted as an additional parameter. So hopefully that makes sense for folks, which I think the link we posted is like, if you really don't understand it, that will really break it down. But so, and just to go back to keyed versus unkeyed, keyed is cached, unkeyed is not cached. All right. So now what they did was they checked this out in various, so they is SNCC. I should say that SNCC built upon James Kettle and the Portswigger team's research by looking at practical sort of issues this arises in with frameworks. So they did Python, I believe, Flask, and Tornado, and going back. Oh, I think Rack for Sinatra Rails. Okay. Ruby on Rails and Sinatra use, I mean, this, but for those listening, that uses Rack as the like middleware layer to handle requests and responses. That's the simplistic version, but we'll just say that's basically what it's doing. Anyways, so they found this in basically the major middleware that underpins hipster frameworks, as you've affectionately called them in the past.
Yes.
Right. So that's essentially what it's doing. Now, I think what's more interesting is that, or not more interesting, but I think what's, and honestly, I would be curious about like the traditional Java. I can't imagine like Java and, C.NET Core and like, like the other enterprise level, we'll say, languages. I can't imagine they're not vulnerable to this in some places, but I don't know if they did any research there. But yeah, it's pretty.
I would imagine they would be, because I keep thinking back to Java, like JS pages, like some of the logging parameters and some of the ways that it deals with like JSession ID, where it'll throw a semicolon with that into the URL, or it used to do that.
No, it still does that. It still does that.
Okay. Yeah.
If it thinks you can't accept cookies, it'll do that.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, and that's just it, right? Because at that point, it's taking advantage of that same flaw almost to track the cookie values in a surreptitious manner, probably thinking that it's not going to be cached, or at least it won't get like the URL won't get cached with that. But so it sounds like there's more research there to be had. Obviously, this is an issue if you can get, especially with cross-site scripting. I think SNCC actually calls that out as far as, hey, we found cross-site scripting in this one page. Now I can basically store that across your cache so that the next 10 people or whatever get hit by it.
Yeah, they showed that in the origin header. So the origin header was an input that was reflected back in their example, unsanitized. So it's unsanitized, it's reflected back to unsanitized, and it'll show up in the response to every request that has the other keyed parameters in it. So, meaning like all the keyed parameters, all the parameters that it checks to see if this is going to be a request that's cached and then rendered to other people that make a similar request. That's what they basically showed, is like if everybody else is making that same type of request, then that reflected origin reflected XSS in the origin header would be echoed back. And honestly, we should probably just mention that real quick. If you've ever seen JSession ID in the URL and you're wondering why, it's backwards compatibility with browsers that aren't accepting cookies. So it makes an assumption that your browser is not accepting cookies, and then it will send you to subsequent portions of the application with a redirect that has the JSession ID in the URL. Because obviously, if it thinks you can't browse the site with cookies, that's the only other way to do it. Now, this is obviously terrible and shouldn't be doing that. Because, and again, why? Well, one of the Seth, one of the easiest ways I've seen this exploited is when people have their logs accidentally exposed. Like, how sometimes there's endpoints on an app where you can access it and then there's logs. Well, if you've got a bunch of URLs that have in that log, a bunch of GET request URLs that have a session ID, it could be JSession ID, PHP session, whatever. That's where I've actually abused that before. It's just been like, well, let me see what this gives me, and then use that session in the URL and then request portions of the app. And then like, if the session's still valid, it's good to go.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, that's always been a fun one, right? Like I remember that showing up years ago, right? We always saw that at Fishnet back in the day. I don't see it as often, but it still is a default. I'm pretty sure for Tomcat that, and any of those, Java application servers. Yeah, the application servers is specifically where it creates a session based on the user when the first time that they hit a page. And then we have all sorts of issues as well with cookie security settings, right? So, I can't remember the names right now. I'm blanking. I'm kind of tired, but that's fine.
Yeah. I really do think web cache poisoning is going to be more of a thing as time progresses. I've seen more of an influx anecdotally in especially Silicon Valley type companies, we'll say, like, leading the tech forefront type companies where, varnish is being used heavily now, and it's being used like to keep the load back, the load and the latency low for those users interacting with the site. So it's been really gaining traction and momentum. So I really do think we'll see more of these vulnerabilities come out. And so that's why it's good to be aware of this particular issue. So actually what's really funny about this is that when we first talked about web cache poisoning, I kid you not, within less than a few days, at work, varnish was brought up, and I was like, oh, thank goodness I did all my homework on this one and research. I was like, this is amazing. Like, what a time, timing on that is amazing. So,
yeah. Well, I mean, I think the two favorites there from a caching perspective are Varnish and Nginx, right? Like, pretty sure those are kind of the heavy hitters right now. I know there's other stuff that's out there, but definitely those are the ones. And I mean, any of the kind of WAF style or like distribution networks will probably do that as well, right? Your CDNs. That being said, somebody like Cloudflare or somebody else probably has more eyes on this than if you're setting up your own Varnish or Nginx server. So it just got to be aware about it. It's like any of the other, security issues that we talk about. As long as you're aware that it can happen, then at least you can look into it. But I dig that Snyk is actually looking into it a little deeper, just to see what frameworks kind of default to this sort of behavior. I know they introduced the semicolon. They also introduced like, hey, what happens when you have a parameter in the URL and also in a post parameter, right? Like what does the collision look like and what actually gets cached? Because that's also, I mean, that's another vector that it could come in as. So cool. All right.
There is before we get into our next technical bit here, I figured I could real quick discuss because Derek had asked about our setups.
Oh yeah.
So I'll post links in our Slack channel and our general Slack channel to the equipment that I use, But as a, and I'll show it here in a second. Let me I'm going to try and stream from this phone. You can see my messy desk, but yeah, anyway, so Ken's messy desk. That's what I'm going to say here. Anyways, while I'm talking, turn that down. That's terrible.
Audio.
Mic is now down. Okay. So for equipment, I'm using, are you hearing any like echo?
Nope, I'm not hearing echo right now.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so for audio, using Blue Yeti. It's black, so I'm not sure why they call it blue. It's like the Navy's version of blue, which is black. Blue Yeti. Rode 1, I don't know if I'm saying that right. Arm, Dragonfly pop filter, and a shock absorber that I believe also comes from Yeti, and it's designed for the Blue Yeti. Then for lighting, because this is the one I've actually gotten asked about this twice now. So that's like a lot for me, Seth. I'm holding my phone underneath my desk. I just realized you can like see under my desk. Anyways, yeah. Anyways, Elgato Key Air Light. But here's the thing. If you get the Elgato Key Air Light, you may have some issues getting it connected to your Wi-Fi network. So if you have an iPhone specifically, believe it or not, you can go into your Wi-Fi settings and it'll say it recognizes this device and it's not connected to the network. Do you want to connect it? And your phone will actually set up the Elgato just naturally. And then you install the Elgato app and you can do stuff such as you can, with my phone, I can turn it off. You can see how dark that looks. You can change the hue around. And yeah, so it's pretty nice. Cool. So, and then the level of brightness can be adjusted. So that's the Elgato Key Air Light. Then the last bit here is I use a Sony AX43 Handycam 4K resolution. This is a new edition. I actually like yours better, Seth. So I would say go with Seth's camera, not mine. But
yeah, like we just did upgrades recently, like over the holidays. I'm actually using a digital SLR, right? Canon Rebel T6 that I had to get like one of the like battery converters so I can stream with it. But the utility from Canon works pretty well. It's got a large CCD, like as far as capturing detail, it does really well. I mean, it's a photo camera, right? That I'm using for streaming is basically what it boils down to. But I've got the same, like, I think I've got the mini, you've got the full like Yeti, whatever mic is
Blue Yeti. That's black.
Blue Yeti. That's black. Yeah. But yeah, that camera seems to work pretty well. And that's what I would suggest. If you have an SLR, like a digital SLR, see if there is a utility out there for it from the manufacturer to stream. Because of the large CCD size, they do give you better detail, right? That's what it is. I mean, webcams, they're so small that you're only going to get so much detail out of it. And then also like image picture quality, right? Like whatever. So yeah, I'm trying to think what I'm using.
I've got the other thing is too that I use is I'm trying to like here, maybe I can add this to the stream. I don't know if this
if you want to.
Yeah. So I use I'm using a standing desk so that I can pretty easily, I use two dual monitor arms from Uplift. I use Uplift's. This is really messy only because I have all my AV set up on here right now. But yeah, so like basically you can see there's the camera. And the cool thing about this is because everything plugs into the desk, I can raise up the desk like I just did and stand and still be able to podcast and have, Zoom meetings and stuff like that. So this is and then the white bar, it's also got a whiteboard deal here. So anyways, that is my desk setup. So I don't know if people wanted to know that either, but there you go. Now you know. All right. And now standing feels good. Someone say keep doing it.
Okay. Yep. Go for it. Cool.
So what do you want to talk about next, man?
Let's talk SSRF. It's the new hipster, vulnerability, right?
Yes.
Well,
so like Eric was the one who posted this one. Let's put the link in there. If you want to talk about it a little bit.
Yes. And Eric was the one that posted this in our chat a couple of days ago, and I saw it floating around a couple actually other chat or Slack channels that I was in, because it does have such a good list, like you were mentioning. Hold on, it's in my links somewhere in here. I thought I had it. Glossary. Yeah. So first thing, SSRF is server-side request forgery. Basically, you're handing some sort of a string to the server, and then the server makes a connection out and returns specific content, right? Like whatever it happened to reach out and get. So blind SSRF is basically inducing functionality that maybe doesn't get returned to you. So similar to blind SQL injection, right? You introduce a string, you can kind of get back a positive, negative response, but with blind SSRF specifically, in this article that we're posting, they talk about, hey, I'm going to go and just shut down Elasticsearch, or I'm just going to go hit this endpoint and have it initiate some sort of an action that is unintended. And it'll do that from the point of the server versus the point of the attacker, right? So whatever permissions the server has to access Elasticsearch, it's going to go do that. The most common one that popped up initially was AWS metadata endpoints, where people would go and try and steal credentials. But once you have access to those metadata endpoints as well, there's other things that you can actually initiate, and that's what Asset Node is going into here. So just because you can't access like the AWS key and secret key, the access key and secret key, doesn't mean that you couldn't, initiate a shutdown. You couldn't change some sort of content on that AWS instance, like do things that were unintended. But at times it's difficult to determine whether or not you can actually hit those endpoints. What was your understanding? What was it that you liked about that article, Ken?
Well, so because Jason Haddix, we had shared a link a long time ago on like a gist of different, specifically like AWS, GCP, and Azure endpoints. So those were the metadata endpoints that he pointed out. This is a more like comprehensive list, I think, outside of, well, I don't want to say more comprehensive. It's focused more on, just varying technologies. And I thought it was really cool because it's like up to date. It's showing like actual abuse of JBoss, Struts, all the stuff that we typically come across at Atlassian. And I think the whole point with SSRF is that, the main thing, so applications have always talked to other services, and I think SQL is like the number one way we used to talk about, abusing an application's behavior, because the DB is typically behind a firewall, but the application isn't. So the application gives you a way to get into the network without having to like find an open port or a machine that has some, vulnerable vulnerable version that Metasploit. You have to use a Metasploit style payload to like exploit it or phish someone. Instead of doing all that stuff, if you can find an application that's vulnerable to SQL injection, you can leverage that to get inside the network since it's already communicating with it, and then extract whatever you want from the DB, or maybe the DB is even more vulnerable than you could have expected, and you can get a command shell on the DB server. Now you've got a command shell reversed out that is allowing you to pivot into the network, right? But over time, as we've talked about, frameworks have protected against SQL injection better and better. It's not to say that it doesn't exist. It's just to say that it's applications have gotten phenomenally better at protecting against SQL injection. So what else do applications talk to? Well, applications talk to everything. Now they talk to other applications, SOA, microservices. They talk to these like the caching in-memory databases. I think Elastic Search was in, or Elastic, I think it was Elasticsearch. I can't remember. You've got Memcache and Redis, and you've got a whole bunch of different services basically that, and I'm trying to think of the other one that's been pretty popular. Kafka pipelines. That's been another way to that applications have been expanding their reach of what they talk to.
Yeah.
So you have all these services and you want to interact with them. There is no injection in the sense of like a SQL query, right? But there is injection in the sense of if it makes a or if it makes a HTTP request, and you can modify what's in that request, and you can even say where you want to go to, and what you want to add, what you want to, what parameters you want to pass, and what you want to ask of that and interrogate of that application. That's the interesting part. This expands upon that in showing how many different things you can test for payload wise to see if you have SSRF, I think, and to like go farther. That's what I thought was interesting about this.
Yeah, it's pretty comprehensive, right? Like, so they've got the HTTPS list or the HTTPS list, WebLogic, PeopleSoft, and I'm sure we can expand upon this. I know somebody's going to take this and dump it into, some list of, endpoints somewhere on GitHub eventually, right? But
Chris Gates. That's you,
already
man.
has. Yeah, Chris.
No, he's the best at taking these types of things and I turning them into like weapon,
weaponizing them. Yeah, because that's honestly what's going on here, right? Is Asset Note, I'm sure, is using this for their bug bounty, the bug bounty side of things. This is stuff that they've run into that they've been able to actually execute, right? Like. It's smart. You start thinking Jenkins, Jira. I also wonder, like, GitLab. Yep, there it is. Right. I was wondering where GitLab was in that list.
I'm going to search for GitHub too because we have an importer too. No, okay, all right.
There's a GitHub repo.
Here we go. GitHub Enterprise Memcache RCE.
Yeah,
because they could talk about Memcache exits.
Yep. Yeah, all of this is, the blind SSRF ideas. That's pretty awesome. I'm gonna have to play with this some because there's more. I know I run into this all the time. We set up like a endpoint in AWS that we can hit using SSRF, but at times that's about it, right? We see those requests come through, but it is blind, so it's difficult to know what else you have access to. So having this list together will be useful for sure.
What's this gopherus?
Gopher?
Gopherus.
What do you mean? Gopherus?
GOPHERUS. If you know a place which is SSRF vulnerable, then this tool will help you generate Gopher payloads for exploiting SSRF and gaining RC. And there's a blog about it. Here, I'm going to put this link in because this is something I need to go look at now and see if I can use this. And that's pretty dope. Yeah.
I mean, Gopher, you know what Gopher is, right? It's an old text-based protocol that was similar to HTTP that you could link, like you could build links in. Have you ever used Gopher before? Man, I'm old. Just
I may have. I don't remember.
Yeah, it was. There's still precursors to it, right? Like, and that's what they're saying, right? You can build Gopher pages and Gopher. You could link HTTP, and it was very text based at the time. Like we're talking early '90s when it was super popular. So, yeah.
No, I think that predates my my hacking. Yeah, this is interesting. Okay, cool. Well, I'm definitely going to check this out. It looks like a Metasploity type interface even. It's got like a CLI little cool interface. I'll have to check that out. Looks pretty dope. I'm honestly like, yeah, I want to play around with it. So,
yeah, you should. You should. I mean, Gopher's a cool.
SSRF is like such a thing now. Yeah.
Yeah, it is. I mean, are you seeing a lot of those come in via bug bounty?
No, not necessarily. But I am seeing. I don't know. I don't go into too much, but I think we're doing a good job of catching things before they hit the internet publicly.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, I mean, we have seen SSRF like definitely. I've talked about it on the podcast before. We've definitely seen SSRF just like maybe less frequently now, but we've done a lot of things which maybe at some point I should talk about to put out some like basic requirements and like if you're putting on a new application here or a new feature, here's some things to think about. And I think that hopefully has been what's helped, but who knows? I don't know. It's kind of hard with what we do to measure, especially when you're a defender. It's hard to measure what your efforts actually do.
Actually equate to.
Yeah. It's pretty easy when you're a consultant. You're like, cool. Sorry. Not saying it's easy to be a consultant. What I am saying is like on this particular piece, I feel like it's a little bit easier to measure your success of what you do because, if you've got a really good test that you're delivering a report on and you like really did a great job and like wrote it up well, like you give it to someone and they're like, oh, cool. You found all these cool vulns. Like there's a little bit of a measurement there, but for like defenders, what do we have? Like, I don't know. We don't know if something we did prevent it, so it's a little hard to measure.
It's a little hard to measure. Come on. You don't want to do a year in review on.
No, that's why I always think it's funny when people talk about collecting metrics. Cause I'm like, man, what are meaningful metrics anyways? Meaningful metrics. I've come to the conclusion, I think that meaningful metrics are just like, you're actually pushing the goals forward and you know what the goals are for.
Yeah.
Beyond that, what like we found 1,000 bugs this month. So that's like, we're definitely more secure. Like, no, maybe you need to focus more on not having those bugs introduced in the first place. So, yeah.
I mean, that may be an interesting discussion to have, though, just in general, because I know coming into it as well, like, as a consultant, my value is so intimately tied with how many bugs can you find, right? Like, just like, giving a report to a client that's like, hey, you guys did really well. And, I only found these couple low items, right? Like it's almost demoralizing. It's hard not to tie your intrinsic like self-worth to this like activity that you've performed, right? Because that's how value is associated with a consulting firm is, hey, were you able, like the red teamers, were you able to get access to whoever's, email account, right? That was your target. And if you can't, you failed. So does that mean you're a bad red teamer, or does it mean like the blue team and like the defensive controls that they put into place were actually successul? It's hard to quantify. And I think that's what you're saying, right? It's hard to quantify what those values actually are and whether or not it is useful, right? I don't know.
I don't know. Yeah, like that is very much I do feel like if you can hand in a report that is like, I've handed in reports where I'm just like, oh man, when they read this, they're going to be like, oh my God, and that's like easy to know that you did a good job. But yeah, there's also a lot of and we talk about it in the course too. It's like, you just because you didn't have like a million findings doesn't mean you didn't do your job, but that's why you need to write down what you did so that, it's very obvious the pieces of the app that you actually reviewed and what you were looking for, and you followed a process. And if you followed that process and you've followed it to the letter and you still don't have many findings, then at least you did your job. And it just happens to be that they did a good job of securing the app. And as a defender, it's like, man, you have so many things that you do. This is the thing I think that was like, for me, my first blue team job was a little kind of like, I guess I was unprepared because, I was coming more from like an offensive standpoint, and you don't realize like how little of bug hunting really plays into an AppSec program, or code security or security engineering or whatever you want to call it. Very little actually. It's like a fraction, and like everything else is like training and framework hardening, like so having like methods that override built-in methods that are more secure for like redirections or whatever, or XSS prevention or whatever. Or it might be like awareness of standards and socializing those standards and making sure that new apps that come online have like basic security hygiene. It can be tracking down, bug bounty stuff these days, but before it was more like we got an email or we had a third party vendor assessment where they did they didn't even tell us. They just started testing our site and they found like a critical IDOR. And now we got to go rush over and figure that out. It could be so many things. It could be the developers for that day are like, hey, we had some weird stack traces and someone's doing some stuff. Is this like a security issue? Do we need to do? It's like a million things you get overloaded with, and very little of it actually ends up being, how many assessments you did and how many bugs you found. So I think for me, that was like the thing with blue teaming that really I wasn't prepared for and didn't really understand.
Yeah.
On my first gig anyways.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, it's definitely not as, you don't necessarily get that same like adrenaline rush, right? Like I know we've talked about this before as a red teamer, right? Like the first time that you get like a SQL injection or, as a consultant, the second that I get a dump of data that I shouldn't be able to get access to, like you get this like rush of adrenaline and, nice dopamine hit that's sweet. Like, I did my job. This is going to pay off. And it's harder on the defensive side to get that sort of filling because you're just moving that needle slowly over time to secure an organization. But I also think there's a lot of defensive jobs out there that go unfulfilled because it is a lot sexier, for lack of a better term, to go on to the offensive side of things and, go break something, right? It's hard to fix. It's easy to break. Yeah.
Isn't that the truth? Although sometimes it's hard to break if you have to chain things together. There's always that aspect that you have to figure out. Which is where someone who that's where the bug bounty I feel like shines, is you get somebody who's like, take SSRF for instance. SSRF is their thing, and they become the best at SSRF, and they dig into your application or applications looking for that one thing, and then you've got maybe 20 other people who are experts in one specific thing, and they're going really deep to chain multiple pieces in the application that are vulnerable to get something meaningful out of it. So I think that's, whenever someone asks me like, oh, do you really see value in the bug bounty? Yeah, sure. There's also a lot of not value in it, but there is that value in it, when you get the good. But again, that comes down to a whole other conversation, which we've had a bunch of times. A lot of people have come on to talk about it. So we don't need to go off on that tangent. Plus we're over time here.
Yeah. Well, we'll go ahead and cut it for this week. I'm trying to think what we've got coming up.
We didn't get to WebAuthn, but we do need to actually get to WebAuthn at some point and like break it down and really explain it. The first time we ever like broached the subject, I was completely like not super aware of how it works. And now that's changed. There's been more information exposed and I've seen code. And so I think like that would be a great thing to talk about. I need to schedule guests. I've been emailing people for swag. So like haven't been emailing people for guests. So we'll start doing that again too this week.
Yeah. We'll have guests on to talk about different topics. But in the meantime, if something pops up that you think should be interesting, that we should at least address, please pop into the Slack channel or hit us up on, DM us on Twitter, whatever, and let us know, because there's always interesting things going on, and we like to dig into everything. Yeah, and everything application security related. We'll keep it there, right?
For now.
For now. Anyway, well, thanks everybody for joining today. As always, reach out. We'll see you all on the interwebs. And have a good week. We'll talk next week.
Thanks, everybody.